Okay, so good evening, everyone, and thank you to those who are here live and on screen. As I just mentioned, I put the link on the chat feature for those who didn't manage to print the handout. And the link is very slightly updated, actually, from the link that I sent out via the WhatsApp group and via the emails. This is now I wanted to look at one particular incident in Emor, the story at the end of the Sedra, which involves the Megadef. The word Megadef is the rabbinic Hebrew word for a blasphemer, and the broad outline of the story, which we'll spend quite a lot of time looking at in more detail, is that of a individual who, for whatever reason, decides to curse in the name of God or curse God himself. And this is the figure known as the Megadef, the biblical blasphemer. Now, before we try and look at the story in detail, it is important to contextualize the story a little bit. And the truth is there are grave difficulties around the structure of our Sedra. And I put these. I put a summary of the structure of the Sedra, more or less cut and pasted from Chabad's website, because that's a convenient place to find a summary of the Sedra, and just as a shorthand way of bringing out the complexity of the Parsha. So the first thing to say is it's whilst its length is not enormous, it contains a significant number of mitzvahs. It's a very, very busy Sedra. It has a large number of mitzvahs. We're familiar with the middle part of the Sedra because it forms the bulk of our laning over the festive season, because it includes the Yomim Tovim and the Yomim Noraim and Shabbos itself, Shabbos, Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkos, Sfiras HaOmer, the period of time we're in the middle of, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkos, and so on. So it's a very central parsha in terms of Kriyas HaTorah. If we look at the structure, basically part one of the Sedra are special laws pertaining to Kohanim, the laws of Kohanim not allowed to become ritually impure, Tome on the death of relatives, who they can marry, physical deformity in terms of bringing korbanos. Then there's some rules around sacrifice and shechita, and that's really part one, to do with Beis HaMikdash linked rules. Part two is the Mikroi Kodesh, the callings of holiness, the Jewish calendar, and that includes Shabbos and the various Chagim and Yomim Noraim that's already mentioned. Part three is the lighting of the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash and the showbread, the Lechem Haponim, which is placed weekly on the Shulchan there. And part four is the incident of the blasphemer, which I just mentioned, followed by the penalties for murder and for injuring or destroying property. Now this is exceptionally difficult, this structure. I mean, the first part of the Sedra does have a type of place here. We're in the middle of Sefer VaYikra. A significant theme in Sefer VaYikra is the role of the Kohanim and service in the Beis HaMikdash. So we understand perhaps why Kohanim are being spoken about here, that we understand. Why then does it go on to talking about Yomim Tovim? Much less clear. Other than there is a broader theme in Sefer VaYikra, which is Kedusha, sanctity. So arguably, what's happening here is actually parts 1, 2, and 3 are all to do with Kedusha. They're all the theme of Kedusha. That last week's Sedra is Kedoshin, and doesn't have much to do with the Beis HaMikdash, the Mishkan, other than the meta theme, the broader theme, which is that of Kedusha. So it talks about sanctity in our personal lives and in our relationships and other such areas. So it may even actually be incorrect to think of VaYikra as Leviticus or Torah's Kohanim is about Kahuna. Maybe the real theme of VaYikra is Kedusha, of which the Beis HaMikdash is one aspect, and the Avodah is one aspect of that Kedusha. So that maybe would explain the broader theme. In which case, as I said, the three parts of the Sedra, of the first three parts, are classic tripartite divide that we often have in themes of Kedusha. Kedusha, sanctity of human beings, sanctity of time, and sanctity of place. And actually, very often that's the order that's followed. So we've discussed on other occasions what Kedusha means and the Meshach Chochmah around that all Kedusha really stems from humans. So it's quite common that when the theme of, when we look at Kedusha as a theme, it starts off with sanctity of humans, then it moves on to sanctity of time, because time in a sense is more integral to us even than place. Time is bound up to the essence of the experience of living as human beings, and then place, which is our geographical location, which is the other area we find ourselves. So that might explain the first three parts of the Sedra. It might be a Sedra of Kedusha. Having said that, it still remains a little unclear. I mean, the third element of Kedusha, the menorah and the showbread, I think we discussed when we learned Terumot Tzaveh that these kelim are unique. They're often singled out and separated. I think we discussed that at the time. Nonetheless, one would have expected this part of the Sefer to be in Terumot and Tzaveh or VaYikra, could they? They're strange that it's revisited here. Then we get to part 4, which is really difficult because part 4 is very hard to explain its location here in the Sedra. So if the menorah and the shulchan would be in Truma and Tzaveh, the blasphemer you would think is in Bar Mitzvah. Some would say the Bar Mitzvah, which is the book of the stories of events that took place in the travel through the Mitzvah. Where exactly in Bar Mitzvah? Well, we'll see shortly. It depends what the story of the blasphemer is about. It's not entirely clear what the story is about. If the story is about encampment rules, where people are camping, then we would perhaps expect it to be in the Sedra of VaYikra. If it's part of a pattern of rebellion against Moshe, then maybe it be in Shalach Lecha or Korach. If it's linked to the Makoshesh story, the story of the gatherer of sticks and woods who break Shabbos, and there are such linkages and parallels made, then we would expect it to be in Shalach Lecha. So we would expect it to be somewhere around one of these sedras. It's very unclear why it's here at all. And then the final section, which is penalties for murder and for injury and so on, seems to belong to Mishpatim, all the way back in Parshat Mishpatim. So that the Sedra is this scattergun of ideas. It's very, very difficult, really, to know what to make of the theme of the Sedra and the structure. Okay, so this is an introduction. This is part 1 of. I don't think we're going to answer all of these questions fully, but this is part 1 of what we're going to try and look at, which is what's the structural theme? Is there anything we can guess about the structure of the Sedra? Part 2 is acknowledging how vague the story is. And I want to just look at the story briefly once, and then we'll look at the story again with Rashi and some of the commentaries. But just glance at the bottom of I think in the new print it's the bottom page 1, in the old print it's the top of page 2. But the beginning of the Parsha, the first psukim of the Parsha, Vayetze ben Isha Yisraelis v'hu ben Ishri b'toich Yisrael, a man who is a son of a Jewish woman and an Egyptian husband goes out, and he fights in the camp, this son of an Egyptian with a Jewish person. Pasuk 10. Pasuk 11, VaYikra, the middle of page 2. VaYikra ben Isha Yitzraelis. Again, I'll just paste the link for those who didn't have it so that you can follow inside if you click on the link. VaYikra ben Isha Yisraelis as Hashem, Vayikalel, the son of the Israelite woman pronounced the name and cursed. By the way, some of the translations here aren't even entirely clear. What exactly is the etymology of the word Vayikov to pronounce is not at all clear. They bring him to Moshe. Then we're told who his mother is. That's the middle of page 2. And pretty much that's the end of the core part of the story. That's what we know about the story. Top of page 3 is they place him in a guard's house till his sentence would be decreed. Middle of page 3 is Hashem tells Moshe that this man is deserving of the death penalty. So that's the structure of these psukim. You're looking for chumash. If you want a general chumash, it's easiest outside. I apologize. Yes.
Thank you so much.
I printed this in very small. I do apologize. Yeah, I should have told people to bring their microfilm readers with so the magnifying glass. Yeah. So it's VaYikra Perek Chaf Daled 24 psukim 10 and onwards. Okay, so we're really told very little about the story, about the details behind the story, what's going on over here. So this is another challenge to our understanding. It's interesting also that this is one of the 4 episodes in the Torah in which Moshe is uncertain how to react. Now we can analyze these 4 episodes in more detail, perhaps evening on another occasion, depending on time. But just to remind you, we have the Megadef, the story of the blasphemer, where Moshe locks him up in a prison until Hashem issues a ruling. We have the story of the Pesach Sheni, which is in Bamidbar Test, in the 9th chapter of Bamidbar, where people approach Moshe and say, we can't bring the carbon Pesach because we're impure, and Moshe doesn't know what to do, and he gets taught the mitzvah of Pesach Sheni. We have the story of the Mekoshesh, which I mentioned earlier in Parsha Shlach Lecha, where someone gathers wood and breaks Shabbos, and again Moshe is unsure how to react, and again Hashem intervenes and says what to do. And finally we have the story of the daughters of Sloth in Perek Chav Zayin of Bamidbar Chav Zayin Chav Tes, in which in Perek Chav Zayin chapter 27, in which again they question inheritance rules, and the Sloth's daughters, not sons, how are the rules of inheritance to be applied in this situation? And again Moshe is unsure. So that's another theme sort of running through the story, a lack of certainty of Moshe in how to deal with this this episode. So this is again another part of the story that maybe we'll try and have a look at. So let's look at the psukim with more care and see what we can make of this. And here we'll start off looking at Rashi, and then we'll see where it goes. So the first point is VaYikra. So in one print version, it's the bottom of page 1 or the top of page 2. The first psukim in the Sefer. VaYikra ben ish Yisraelis v'hu ben ish Mitzvi. Where did he go out to? Who was this individual? So Rashi on the top of page 2 brings a number of explanations. Either VaYikra, he went out of his world. In other words, he left life. What does that mean? He left life. He left his spiritual life. VaYikra, he made a decision to leave the spiritual pathway of the Jewish people. The second explanation is he went out from the above passage. Very, very interesting. In other words, we just learned the laws of the Shulchan, and one of the laws of the Shulchan is that the bread, says Rashi, should be left on the Shulchan for a whole week. He mocks this. He says, how can this be that bread should be left for a week? It's not fresh, it's not warm. That's not a fit way to treat the king. A most bizarre rebellion imaginable. This is what leads him to his skepticism. Then the Rashi brings, he went out of court. He left court guilty. And this feeds into the continuation of Psukim, in which on the one hand he is of Don, Shevet Don, Danite ancestry. He is a son of Shlomis Bastibri Lamate Don. On the other hand, he is a Ben Ish Mitzri. He is the son of an Egyptian man, but the son of a Jewish mother. And he goes out, seems to indicate there's something around his ancestry. And Rashi brings from a Midrash that what's happening here is he's being bullied. He's not being given a place to settle. He hasn't got a place in the camp. He wants to live amongst his brethren in Dom. They don't want him because he's the son of an Egyptian. He goes to Beis Din and he loses. And he comes out fuming. He's furious about this situation. In this reading, by the way, when it says Vayinotsu, they quarreled in the camp, it may mean this is a physical quarrel, or it may refer to the court case itself, an interesting way of defining a court case. The Vayinotsu, and in the first pasuk, they quarrel, they argue in the camp, might mean they argue about the camp. In other words, they go to court and he loses the court case. Then Rashi analyzes his ancestry. Ben Ish Mitzvi, he's the son of a Mitzvi. Who are Mitzvi Shahar Moshe? Who is this Egyptian? This is the Egyptian that Moshe killed. So let's remind ourselves. Let's go to in the new handouts. This is the bottom of page 4. For those who printed the old handouts, I'll just do a screen share actually, because I apologize. I sent handouts an incorrect version of the handouts, which I will therefore share my screen so everyone has this on them. This is the story in Shemos chapter 2. Vayi bayomim aheim, vayagdal Moshe, I'm sorry, I'm also struggling to read the text. Moshe grew old, vayetzel ochiv, he went out to his brothers, vayah b'sivlosom, he sees their suffering, vayah ish mitzri makeh ish ivrim ochiv, he sees an Egyptian smiting a Jewish person. Vayifen kovako, he looks either way. Vayaki enish, he sees no one there. Vayach asamitri, vayitmeinu b'chol, he kills the Egyptian and buries him in the sand. So Rashi links this story here to the story there, and he says, who is this Mitzri? This is the Mitzri that Moshe killed. what's the story over here? Why did Moshe kill the Mitzvi? Because and why is the Mitzvi beating? Well, Moshe kills the Mitzvi because the Mitzvi is beating a Jew. Why is the Mitzvi beating the Jew? Because this is the Mitzvi who has entered into a relationship with a Jewish woman, fathered a child who is this child here in the story, and Moshe intervened in that story, killed this Egyptian who was now beating the spouse, the husband of the woman with whom he entered into relationship, had been objecting to the relationship, and that's who this Mekoshesh is. A most remarkable Midrash. I mean, where on earth does this Midrash get any of these details from? It's not now the place to discuss Midrashim exactly, and many Midrashim maybe were based on traditions and Torah Shebal Peh that Chazal had. But nonetheless, how is this fitting into the story, and where is the story telling us any of these indications? And certainly if this is a Midrash which isn't based on a tradition, it's based upon a reading of the Pesukim, where does the Midrash derive the story from? But let's learn Rashi inside first and just hear this. So we're now reading Rashi in about a third of the way or quarter of the way down page 2. Then Ish Mitzri, the son of an Egyptian man, who are Mitzri Shahaga Moshe. This is the Egyptian that Moshe killed, according to the Medrash, by uttering the divine name. B'toich b'nei Israel, amongst the children of Israel. In other words, he's described as living b'toich b'nei Israel, amongst the children of Israel. Melamed sheniskaya, this teaches that he converted. Now the Ramban explains that what this is saying is he is as much a convert as anyone else. B'toich b'nei Israel, he's living amongst the b'nei Israel. Is this discrimination against him justified? Well, maybe to a certain degree, because he's not a member of Don, he doesn't come from the tribe of Don. On the other hand, he's B'soich b'nei Israel, because let's not forget that his mother is Jewish, and he is, everyone has gone through a Geirus process, a conversion process at Har Sinai. So he's B'soich b'nei Israel, he's embedded amongst the Jewish people. Vayinotsu b'machaneh, Rashi translates this as they quarreled about about the camps. It's not that they're quarreling, fighting in the camp. Where are they fighting? According to the earlier Rashi, maybe they're fighting in Beis Din, in court. They're fighting about the matters of the camp. Now, how does he react? So this is Pasuk Yud Aleph, halfway down at page 2. VaYikra ben Ish HaYisraelis, he curses this man, the son of the Jewish mother and Egyptian father, Yikov, pronounces the name, VaYikra, and curses. So Rashi says over here, based on Unclus, that this unusual word VaYikov means to pronounce clearly, to explicate something, to clarify something. The Unclus translates it as Oporish, it's pronounced. The root of the word Vayikov in this understanding would be it's linked to an enclosure and a boundary and an encirclement and a delineation. So Vayikov is he clearly delineated. Remember, by the way, our avoda of Yom Kippur, where we talk about the Kohen Gadol, Hayom Farish Es Hashem. This is the same Aramaic later Hebrew word that's being used over here of explicating clearly. This is the Shem HaMeforash. So the blasphemer pronounces God's name perfectly, accurately, VaYikra, and then curses tragically this name of God. And this is going to be important because blaspheme, later we will learn, only applies to one who uses God's full name, not one who references God with a borrowed name, a shenkin, or a nickname. Only one who uses the actual Torah name that refers to the Hashem in the highest form that we humans are capable of referencing him. Not one who uses the weaker names, Hakadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem, or God, or any of the sort of borrowed terminology that we sometimes use to define to call Hashem. Finally, near the end of page 2, Rashi discusses the name of his mother and what we know about her. Shlomis Bas Dibri. She was called Shlomis Bas Dibri. Now, 2 points, says Rashi. First of all, why is her name being mentioned over here? It's an interesting thing that very often the Torah leaves names anonymous. In fact, this story is full of anonymous names. There's an Ish Mitzri, a Ben Ish Mitzri, Ben Isha Yisraelis, an Ish Yisraeli. The names are all anonymous. There's only 2 figures here in the story that appear with name. Moshe, who's judging the case, and there's Shlomis Bas Dibri. So why is her name mentioned over here? Why is her name important? Why is it name thrown into the middle of the story? Now, there are two ways of reading the mention of a name. Shlomis Bas Dibri could be a beautiful name. Shlomis, Sholem, someone who's peaceful. Bas Dibri, Dibri seems to have connotations of speech. That's not how Rashi takes it. Rashi says Shlomis Bas Dibri, she is someone who is overly friendly. Shlomis, Shomit, everyone she meets, she is saying shalom, hello, hello, hello to. Bas Dibri, she speaks too much, she's overly over connector. There's a flirtatiousness about her, which results in her having this affair with the Egyptian, which results in her mothering a child who is a child of an Egyptian and a Jewish woman, which leads to the story of the betrayed husband encountering the Egyptian, getting beaten up, which leads to Moshe needing to intervene and rescue the Jew and kill the Egyptian, which leads to this half Egyptian, half Jewish child who doesn't know how he fits into the camp. So this is the sort of sum totality of the story as pieced together by the Midrashim that we have read over here. This is the story as brought by Rashi. Now, it's an interesting thing. The several of the Mefarshim, the Kliyaka, the Alshich, the Ralbag, all say that actually what's really motivating this individual over here is a resentment of Moshe. Because it turns out, according to this Midrash, that actually Moshe is the slayer of the father of this person. Because this person is a Ben Ish Mitzvi. This person is the son of an Egyptian man who Moshe ended up killing. So this is the first interesting point. They see this as a personal spite against Moshe. There's an interesting feature over here, which is that Moshe excuses himself from the. Someone posted here saying, "Does that mean?" Let's look at the text here. So does that mean that she's an adulteress? Yes, in this reading of Rashi, she's an adulteress. That's how Rashi understands the story and the nature of Shlomis Bas Dibri. There is, by the way, as an aside, a possibility that this is why Moshe excuses himself from the judgment and passes the judgment over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because maybe Moshe is a party to what's gone over here, on over here. In fact, there are Mefarshim that read that the story isn't about an individual cursing Hashem, but an individual using the name of Hashem to curse someone else. Perhaps Moshe is the victim of the curse, either because he's unhappy with the court case going against him, or because Moshe he carries a grudge against Moshe for all this time, because Moshe is the one who killed his father. This is how the Mefarshim suggest the reading of the story. Let's turn to page 3, where we're told this. VaYinecheu b'mishma, pasuk 12. They place him in a prison. Lifrosh lohem al pi Hashem, to explain or specify to them according to the words of Hashem. To my shock, I noticed this name of Hashem, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, I've left unredacted in full. So I'd ask those of you who printed the sheets, please to make sure they get put in Shemus. I see that I didn't. We're learning a Parsha about respect due to Hashem's name, so these sheets should not be discarded. Unfortunately, I left the name of Hashem full over here. Okay, so Moshe removes himself from the court case. Now, there is a question over here. Where do Chazal come from? Where are they seeing this whole narrative? Where does this emerge from? And I'm going to ask those who have the new version of the sheets to turn back to page 4, where I've printed the source from the original story in VaYikra. And again, I will share that with those of you online, because I apologize, I sent the earlier version of the source sheet out. And if we compare, in fact, if you hold this source at the end of page 2 in parallel to the psukim at the beginning of our Parsha, which I seem to have mislaid. I was just hunting for these sheets a minute ago. Okay. Oh, here we are. Okay, sorry. Pasuk 1 in our Parsha, Pasuk 2, Pasuk 3 have an uncanny resemblance to the story in the beginning of Shemos. So let's have a look again at the story. And this time I put the letters in bold. Vayhi bayom mahim, and it was in those days. Vayagdel Moshe, Moshe great up. Vayetze el ochiv, he goes out to his brothers. So this is Shemos chapter 2, Pasuk 11. Vayetze el ochiv, he goes out to his brothers. Vayabasiv losim, and he sees them in their suffering. Vaya ish Mitzvi, he sees an Egyptian man. So we have a parallel. We have the words Vayetze, someone going out. We have an Ish Mitzvi, Make Ish Ivri, who's interacting with an Ish Ivri. The story carries on. Moshe smites this Egyptian. VaYikra bayom hasheni, he goes out on the second day. V'nei shnei anoshim ivrim nitzim, two Jewish men who are fighting. Vayom Rasha, etc. Lama Make Reacha, why are you smiting your fellow human being? So this is in fact the only Parsha in the Torah in which you have these three features aligning themselves again. An Ish Mitzvi, an Ish Ivri, someone VaYikra, someone going out, and Nitzim, this unusual verb to describe fighting. So we're understanding where Chazal get the parallel in the story from. In fact, this also gives us a reverse parallelism in the story, because there is a Midrash on that story in Shemos, which also remains incomprehensible, which the Midrash says, Vayach, when the Midrash says that Moshe smites the persecuted Egyptian oppressor and buries him in the sand, the Midrash says, how did Moshe kill this individual? By using the name of Hashem. By using the Shem HaMefurish, the name of Hashem, Moshe has the mystical ability to use the name of Hashem to smite the Egyptian. So what we have is we have two sets of Midrashim, both of which we're left wondering where they come from. Where does the Midrash get that our story here in Emor has anything which refers to this man from Don, has anything to do with Moshe and him killing the Egyptian? And in that story, where does the Midrash see anything about the Shem HaMefurish? It seems these two stories are linked. This is what the Midrash is doing, is linking these stories. It's saying this is a parallel story. The story in Shemos illuminates our story. This is the story of a liaison between an Egyptian and a Jew. It also tells us what they are fighting about. Why is the Egyptian smiting the Jew? Because we see in our story that this is an example of the only example of which we are aware, in which an adulterous affair takes place between an Egyptian and a Jew. We know again and again, in fact, the Torah tells us in Mishpach Hoseyam, it's important for the Torah to stress the purity of the Jewish people despite the persecution of Egypt, but this is a breakdown in that purity. And here in the story, we see the Egyptian, semi-Egyptian, semi-Jewish individual misusing the name of Hashem, and the Midrash links it back to Moshe using the name of Hashem. In fact, I'll just mention as an aside that there's a pattern of such Midrashim. There's two occasions in which the Midrash, in which the name of Hashem is used midrashically, and on both occasions it's used correctly initially, but has disastrous consequences, perhaps telling us something about caution around how we use the name of Hashem. Moshe uses the name of Hashem to kill this Mitzvi, and the Mitzvi's son curses this very name. Moshe uses the name of Hashem to bring up the Atzmos Yosef, the bones of Yosef, according to the Midrash. That the Atzmos Yosef should come up, and according to the Midrash, this is the same name used by Micha, who has observed this story, to bring up the Egel Hazav at the time. So the Midrash seems here to be linking with using the name of Hashem, even for the best motives, often has disastrous consequences in as a result. Now, why is there an absence of the story here in the Torah? What are we meant to make of this Parsha? Why is the Parsha so vague? Why doesn't it tell us the details of the story? So what we've seen so far, just to summarize where we've gone so far, is we've seen a very mysterious Parsha. The whole story consists basically of two pesukim. An individual goes out, fights in the camp, curses, and blasphemes. That's the whole story. No details given, including barely any nameage other than the name of Shlomo Dibri. What's the explanation behind the story? Well, we've seen a Midrashic reading that ties it in, and we've understood a bit better where the Midrash comes from, in which the Midrash ties it into another parallel story in which you seem to have similar features of Mitzvi, of Israeli, of VaYikra, of Vayinotsu, of this unusual language of struggle, and therefore the Midrash pieces together the story, either based on oral tradition or some other Midrashic point that it's trying to make. But why is there an absence of the real story? And I think that one can give a really two answers, which I think are really in essence one. Whenever one reads the Megadef story, this story, at least as understood by the Midrash, I think one can't help but feel sorry for the Megadef. He's woefully mistreated. I mean, it may be he doesn't have a place in the camp. That is Moshe's pasak. But was Don right to make a fuss about this or not? We're not entirely clear. Maybe they had to. Maybe each Shevet has to live separately, and maybe that's important. In fact, again, I remind ourselves that this comes in the episode of Kedusha. This is part of the Kedusha Parsha, and maybe this is about how camps have to work, but do they respond appropriately? What was this individual's life like? He's a Ben Ish Mitzvi. What does it like to be a Ben Ish Mitzvi living in amongst Klal Yisrael? What does it do to his identity? Incidentally, Rav Shimshon of Harsh reads the story a little bit differently. And he says this is someone who is confused about his identity. This isn't just about a fight in the camp, but this is someone who has Egyptian-like qualities. He ends up cursing Hashem because he's not happy with the whole story of Yetzias Mitzrayim and everything else. He perhaps, as we saw, carries a grudge against Moshe, who killed his father. Whatever we understand the story, even leaving all the Midrashim aside, it can't be easy. The story is something about being a Ben Ish Mitzvi and a Ben Yisraelis. This is an individual who clearly had a hard life. So why does the Torah not tell us the story? Well, one level of answer is perhaps the Torah is saying this is irrelevant. It's not the point. Yes, he's provoked. Yes, things are tough. Yes, he's had a troubled upbringing. But there's limits. He still has responsibility. He still has to go forward with what he's done. Is Klal Yisrael at all responsible for their behavior? So there's a very interesting pasuk over here which indicates that even though he is guilty, and as we just said, at the end of the day they are responsible, nonetheless they bear some responsibility for this. And this is pasuk Yodalad, printed in the middle of page 3, pasuk 14, where Hashem gives the ruling as to what is meant to happen. Hashem speaks to Moshe. Take this blasphemer outside the camp. All those who heard should lean their hands on his head. And the whole congregation should stone this individual. Now, what is smicha? Why do we lean our hands on someone's head? So we know what smicha is. Smicha is performed when one brings a carbon chatzos, in fact. So smicha is when you lean on the animal, and we spoke about the earlier parts of VaYikra, I've spoken about this on other occasions. The idea of the carbon as a meditative, reflective process, the Ramban says this, that one looks at this and realizes this being of flesh and blood, which is going to be killed, really should have been me. I should have been the one that's guilt, that should have been in its place. I am a sinner, I need to bring a carbon chatzos. So smicha is performed when there's a transfer of something. Smicha can be used for the positive. Ordination, rabbinic ordination, back in the day, the classical ordination, which was from generation to generation, is performed through smicha. We find, for example, Moshe giving to Yeshua the power of leadership, and there's a transfer of authority in a positive way when smicha is done. The smicha is a transfer of something. In the case of a carbon, a transfer of guilt. Why is there smicha taking place over here? Why is there a leaning taking place on the head of this Megadef? It seems to be that the shomim who are there, those who witness the stories, bear some guilt. They bear some responsibility. What guilt do they bear? So in the Midrashim or Midrashim, there's two explanations. Either they bear the guilt of having heard this. To hear such a terrible thing, in fact, in in Chazal's terminology, we don't even talk about one who curses God. We use a euphemism and we say one mevorich Hashem, someone who blesses Hashem, because it's such a terrible thing to even think about the idea of cursing HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So something terrible has happened to them. They've heard this, therefore they have a collective. It's sullied and diminished their respect for HaKadosh Baruch Hu and diminished their own awareness of Hashem in the world. Therefore, they bear some responsibility. But the other explanation is these are the witnesses, these are the people that saw the story. In other words, these are the people who are involved in the treatment of this Makalo. And they bear some guilt because at the end of the day, they are parties to what happened. So the Torah in this reading is giving us a nuanced explanation, in which on the one hand, it's telling us the story in a sense is irrelevant, the excuses don't matter. Yes, this individual's had a terrible life, and we empathize with that. And the individuals who mistreated him bear guilt for how they mistreated him, absolutely. But then today he has to take the responsibility for his actions. So this is one understanding of the reason for the Torah telling us this story in this way. There's a second way of understanding the structure of the story, which is maybe it's important to the Torah that the parallel to the story of Moshe should emerge from the text itself, and we should equate the two stories which were seen parallel each other so remarkably in the language. Both of them, in Chazal's understanding, have the use of Hashem's name, but in a very different way. In the case in Shemos, we have an Egyptian bullying a Jewish person, and in the case of our story, we have a Jewish person bullying a semi-ish Mitzvi. All cases anonymous, nonetheless responsible, but maybe actually telling us something about how Klal Yisrael is behaving over here. Are they adopting, in some shape or form, the behavior of the Mitzrayim? The Mitzrayim persecuted them in Mitzrayim, and now you have a tragic incident in which they are persecuting back. In fact, Chazal say that whenever persecution happens, whenever someone invalidates their fellow, it's because there's something within them that is more common to the victim of their bullying than they are willing to acknowledge. And as we bully weakness because we have in ourselves a weakness. We call out shame on others because we have within ourselves some element of the shame. This is a Gemara in Kedushin. The Gemara says, "Kol haposel b'muma posel." Whoever invalidates, posel, calls someone else posel, is with their own mum, their own injury, that they are puzzling, they are invalidating the other. Very interestingly, the Midrash reads this Midrashically into the psukim in the continuation of the Sedra. And here I want you to turn to what I mentioned at the end of the psukim, in which the psukim talk about the psukim talk about damage to each other. These are pasuk, your test pasuk 19 and pasuk 20 on page 4. And the Midrash is talking about damages, but listen to the language of the psukim and how the Midrash reads these psukim. The ish kiyiting mum ba'amisoi. If one person puts a blemish upon their fellow, kasher osa, as they did, kenya asalo, so should be done to them. In other words, if you invalidate someone, recognize that you carry within you that same invalidation. And then the next pasuk kaf, kasher yitin mum ba'odom, kenya asalo, as the person puts a wound in a person, so should be put into them. In other words, there's a kolot posel, remember posel here. So it's ironic that the Bnei Yisrael, who are being so zealous to chase out of the Machneh the Ish Mitzvi, perhaps the pasuk is telling us they are behaving more Ish Mitzvi-like than they recognize. They think they are ridding themselves of the impurity of a semi-Mitzvi in their camp, and unwittingly they are making themselves into semi-Mitzviyim in their behavior through this mechanism of kolot posel b'mumoi posel. Now it's interesting also because there's a powerful continuation to this, and here again I want us to look at in new prints at the bottom of page 4, and in the I'll share on the screen again because I didn't print these psukim earlier. I just want to look at the continuation of the story there in Shemos. Because after the top of, again, Shemos chapter 2, pasuk 11 to 14, Yodalef to Yodalet, describes the story of Moshe encountering the Egyptian persecuting the Jew, Moshe killing them, the two Jewish people fighting. But we know how the story carries on. Moshe has to run away from Egypt as a result of his actions. Where does Moshe run to? He runs to Midian, where he encounters the daughters of Yisro at the well, and he defends the daughters. The daughters come back to Yisro, who ask them what happened today, how come you're back early? And here we get to the crucial pasuk, pasuk 19. Vatomana, and the daughters of Yisro say, Ish Mitzvi, I'll just point this with my cursor, Ish Mitzvi hitzilonu miat haroyim, an Egyptian man saved us from the shepherds. And so the story continues. Now, the Midrash comments on this, that Moshe was punished for this episode because they called him an Ish Mitzvi. Why is Moshe guilty of being called by the daughters of Yisro an Ish Mitzvi? Evidently because he looked like an Ish Mitzvi. Why did he look like an Ish Mitzvi? Well, something about him triggered a thought in which they see him and they look at him and they say, this is an Egyptian. Why does he look a bit like an Egyptian? Well, we know why, because actually he grew up in the house of Paro. The Midrash says that there's a bit of a claim here against Moshe. And again, whenever we talk about Moshe, we have to be cautious. We're talking about the great Moshe. On the other hand, this is still Moshe at the beginning of his life. He's already capable of intervening, of saying the shame on Forish and so on. Not talking about a chas v'shalom, a small figure, but there's something mitzvah that lingers about him. So what we actually have in this story is that Moshe. We said there's a parallel over here. There's an Egyptian bullying a Jew in the first story. In the second story, there's a Jew bullying an Egyptian. In the first story, Moshe intervenes and he leaves his Egyptian identity to deal with this. This is the beginning of Moshe. VaYikra Moshe, Moshe beginning to go out to his brothers. In the second story, the Megadef, who is Israel, all said and done, he's Besoich B'nai Israel, he is a member of Klal Israel, leaves his Jewish identity to go back out of his resentment to his Egyptian identity. So this is a second way of understanding the anonymity in the psukim and the lack of detail of the story, because maybe the Torah wants the story to be read coupled with the story in Shemos in the way that the Midrash teaches us to read the story, because it's only by seeing the two stories in parallel that we can actually fully understand what's really going on. By the way, I will mention over here that the Safano emphasizes that when they do kill this individual, it's important to HaKadosh Baruch to stress that this is not about the Egyptian base origins of this individual. This is not malice. This isn't because this person has attacked Moshe. This isn't because this person is half Mitzvi. And have a look at the psukim at the bottom, page 3 and onto page 4, in which this point is emphasized again and again. Ve'el b'nei Yisrael tadaber leimor, pasuk Tesvav, pasuk 15, and to the children of Israel, this is back in the end of our Sedra, ish any person who curses Hashem has to bear responsibility for their sin. Who is this being taught to? The Bnei Israel. This isn't just about this individual. Pasuk Tesain, pasuk 16. V'nokev shem Hashem b'os yomas. One who curses Hashem shall die. Ragim yukamu b'kol ha'ita. Everyone should kill him. K'ger ke'ezrach. Like the stranger, the ger, like the citizen, but not for Shem Yomas. If they curse Hashem Shaddai. So again, this is not about who is doing the cursing. Have a look at Pasuk Kaf Gimel, Kaf Beis, Pasuk 22, which is now part of this bizarre, and we'll come to in a few moments, interruption of the Psukim, which now talk about laws of justice and when you damage someone and so on. Mishpat echad yelochem. One justice should be to you, one justice system should be to you. Keger ke'ezrach yeh, like the convert, like the citizen should be the justice, because I am Hashem, your God. So this is not about one set of rules to one set of rules to other. Rashi comments on Pasuk 22, Pasuk Kaf Beis on page 4, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, Elokei kulchem, I'm the God of everyone. Kashem shani miyachid shmi aleichem, kach ani miyachid shmi alageim. Just like I link my name to you, so do I link my name to the Geim. So this isn't about punishing a ger. More than that, I am the God of all of you. So what? Maybe this was the halacha. Maybe this was how it had to be. But this was the only way you could sort it out. Something that triggered this person to feel so rejected that they responded in this way. I'm the God of all of you. As much as I'm miyachid my name, I link my name to you, I link my name to the convert. So what's gone wrong that you're responding in this way? The somchu, when the death penalty is carried out, you can't just take, by the way, this never happens normally. Normally you don't do smicha to death penalty. We're not guilty for the crime and thing. But here the somchu, you have to recognize that you bear some responsibility for the sin of this individual. So this is a way of understanding the psukim and what the Midrash is trying to tell us. Now, what I'd like to just conclude with doing is try and step back and look at the bigger picture over here. What is the Parsha of Kedusha going on over here? If Emor is indeed part of VaYikra, and if the bigger theme of VaYikra is Kedusha, we've seen there's Kedusha of individuals. The Sedra starts with Kohanim. The Kedusha of time and place in the middle, which is the Beis HaMikdash and the sanctity of the Yom Tovim. And then this whole story about the Megadef, the blasphemer, and then a story about damages done to human beings and to animals. And the suggestion I'm making is that there is a double structure floating around over here. There's a double flow of pasukim that we need to understand. This is referred to by textual analysis as they call it a chiastic structure. A chiastic structure is when there's a mirror structure. I think I've spoken about it before in the setting, where there's a mirror format to structure pasukim. So you have A, B, B, A. The whole Sedra seems to follow this chiastic structure, and the end of the Sedra seems to have a symmetry woven within the symmetry. And I just want to bring out the beauty of the structure over here. And I'm going to argue that a structure of our Sedra is A, B, B, A. It starts off with the Kedusha, the sanctity of individuals. It then moves in the middle to the sanctity of time and space. And then it moves back to the Kedusha of individuals. And the story of the Megadef It is about sanctity of individuals. It's about Kedusha of Am Yisrael. It's about Kedusha of Gerim. It's about how we're meant to treat each other, how we're meant to treat the name of Hashem, and how we're meant to respond, of which part of that is the continuation of the Torah, in which there's something terrible has happened over here. Someone has cast Hashem and they have to be put to death. There are terrible things that happen. In a moment, we're going to look at the Psukim. One who murders a human being is Chayiv Misa, and one who damages even property has to pay penalty. In other words, the conclusion of the Sefer is a reversion to the original start of the Sefer in a parallel, but in a very different way. The beginning of the Sefer starts off with the Kedusha of the Kohanim, the Kedusha of Kohana. The end of the Sefer starts off with is back to the Kedusha of humans, but humans where everything breaks down, where someone's a Megadef, where they're Benich Mitzvi, where there's Shlomis Basdibri, who's a complicated, not such clear-cut character, where there's a row between people who aren't getting Ezra completely and behaving in the right way. This is a different form of a reversion back to the idea of Kedusha. And I want to show you that within this chiastic structure is a second embedded chiastic structure. Because the last few psukim in the Sefer are very difficult to understand. As I mentioned, it's unclear why they're here at all. And it's unclear why they seem to be dealing with mishpat, with just laws of torts and damages, right? It's a damaging thing. And it's unclear how the psukim are arranged. And here I'm referring basically to page, bottom page 3 and all the way through page 4. It just says if a human strikes another human, they should be put to death. If one slays an animal, you have to pay compensation and so on. I'm not going to read through the psukim inside. I'm just going to summarize the structure outside. And the order is as follows of the psukim. And again, it's what we call a chiastic structure, but a more complicated one. It's actually in this form, it's A, B, C, D, with D in the middle, and then a reversion C, B, A. So that you've got a mirror parallel with something in between, something special in the middle, and out of that radiating. So it's A, B, C, a central part in the middle, and then C, B, A reversion. And the structure is as follows. It starts off with instruction to put to death a blasphemer. It then talks about the murder of a human. Then it talks about the killing of an animal. Then it talks about injuring a human. Then it talks about injuring an animal. Then it talks about injuring a parent. And then it reverts to the carrying out of the sentence of the death of the blasphemer. So interrupting the story of the instruction to kill the blasphemer and the actual carrying out of the penalty of the blasphemer is these whole instructions. And the parallel goes as follows. It starts off with the instruction to kill the blasphemer and it ends with the killing of the blasphemer. That's A at the beginning and A at the end. That's the sandwich. In the middle, you have a very interesting sequence to look in. You have the killing of a human, which if you kill a human, you're chayav misa. If you kill an animal, you pay compensation. There's a difference between killing an animal and killing a human. Then it has, if you injure a human, you pay compensation. That's the middle element. And then it radiates outwards. If you injure an animal, if you injure a parent, blaspheme. So blaspheme parallels blaspheme, the instruction to kill the blasphemer and the death of the blasphemer. The killing of a human parallels injuring parents. Only the injury of parents has a shiur misa, has the death penalty, paralleling the killing of a human. Injury of anyone else not. Then you have the injury of a human being. The injury of an animal, the killing of an animal, and the injury of an animal paralleling. And in the middle, you have the injury of a human being. In other words, the blasphemer sentence matching the carrying out of the blasphemer. The murder of a human matching the injury of a human. The killing of an animal matching the injury of an animal. So when it comes to animals, killing of an animal and injuring an animal, both are treated as property crimes. These are not crimes of affecting humans. And in the middle, injury of a human being. And here we have the famous language of the pasuk of ayin tachas ayin, shein tachas shein, etc. The eye for an eye, the tooth for a tooth. Now, on other occasions, I've spoken about the view of Rashi, which actually is printed here again on the source sheet. In Rashi argues this is Pashutoi Shel Mikra. The simplest understanding of the pasuk does not mean the famous lex talionis, the famous retributive justice of knocking out an eye because I knocked out an eye. And the language of the psukim Rashi learns doesn't indicate that. It says kasheyin nothing, just as you give. If we look at the psukim, just very briefly in this context, pasuk 19. V'ishki yitain mumba amiso kasher osa keni osa loy. Sheva tachas sheva, ayin tachas ayin, shein tachas shein, yitain kasher yitain mumba odem keni nosin boy, etc. Rashi translates it to mean ayin tachas ayin, an ayin place of an eye. In other words, monetary contribution, not an eye for an eye. The Rambam learns differently. The Rambam says the Pashutoi Shel Mikra, the simplest understanding of the pasuk, is indeed, let's tell honest, retributive justice. However, the Torah says we can suspend that by monetary compensation. In other words, injury of a human being is damage to Tzelem Elokim, to the dignity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's an attack against a person. What the pasuk is telling us is killing of an animal is like injury of an animal. At the end of the day, it's financial. Injury of a human is like a murder of a human. It's lacking the kedusha and sanctity of what a human being is. However, when it comes to a killing of a injury of a person, you can get away with financial compensation as a lessening of the core sentence. But in truth, the real penalty should be kasha also kenyasa. You did this to someone else. This should be what you experience yourself. So the Torah in its structure, the parallelism of the structure is setting up. Killing an animal is like injury of an animal. In neither case is this a crime of deep morality or breakdown of human relations. People sometimes damage property. You have to pay to compensate that. Killing of a human and injury of a human also link up together. It's true superficially in terms of penalty. Injury of a human, injury of an animal, and killing of an animal are all the same in monetary compensation. But in truth, the injury of a human is like the killing of a human. In other words, this is revisiting the laws of Mishpatim, but from the perspective of Kedusha. So this is a suggestion as to the structure of the Sedra. This is a Parsha of Kedusha. It starts off with the Kedusha of a human, moves on to the middle, the Kedusha of time and space, and moves back to the Kedusha of humans in a very interesting way. It talks about the Megadef. It parallels the Megadef with the injury of humans of each other, or the murder of humans to each other, contrasting it to damage done to property. Damage to humans is not property damage, and it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu emphasizing what happens here is wrong. For some Yudaim, one needs to bear guilt on the one hand, and on the other hand, none of this excuses the Megadef. None of this justifies his behavior. Look at the parallel story, contrast it to how Moshe behaves on the one hand, but on the other hand, realize where this person is coming from. A degree of sympathy for this individual. We bear guilt for how we treated them, and nonetheless, they have the responsibility. We can go through difficult experiences, but at the end of the day, we have to take responsibility for how we respond to them. That's a suggestion in the reading of the Psukim, and the difference, as I entitled the shiur, between the biblical blasphemer and the Midrashic Megadef, what we see in the Psukim and what the Midrash fills in the story. So I'll stop there, and thank all of you online for joining, and I wish you all a good day. Thank you so much for joining, and look forward to seeing you next week after the break we've had. We now have a clear run of hopefully being able to learn the Parsha together. So thank you so much for joining. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Zobin.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much.